Hey everyone, this is the stuff at the beginning of Finance Capital by Rudolf Hilferding. Finance Capital, a study of the latest phase of capitalist development by Rudolf Hilferding. Edited with an introduction by Tom Bottomore, and I'm going to read that introduction. This was translated by Morris Watnick and Sam Gordon. The table of contents read, Part 1, Money and Credit. Chapter 1, The Necessity of Money. Chapter 2, Money in the Circulation Process. Chapter 3, Money as Means of Payment, Credit Money. Chapter 4, Money in the Circulation of Industrial Capital. Chapter 5, The Banks and Industrial Credit. Chapter 6, The Rate of Interest. Part 2, The Mobilization of Capital, Fictitious Capital. Chapter 7, The Joint Stock Company. Chapter 8, The Stock Exchange. Chapter 9, The Commodity Exchange. Chapter 10, Bank Capital and Bank Profit. Part 3, Finance Capital and the Restriction of Free Competition. Chapter 11, Surmounting Obstacles to the Equalization of Rates of Profit. Chapter 12, Cartels and Trusts. Chapter 13, The Capitalist Monopolies in Commerce. Chapter 14, The Capitalist Monopolies in the Banks. The Transformation of Capital into Finance Capital. Chapter 15, Price Determination by the Capitalist Monopolies and the Historical Tendency of Finance Capital. Part 4 of the book is titled Finance Capital and Crises. With the headings, The General Conditions of Crisis, The Causes of Crisis, Credit Conditions in the Course of the Business Cycle, Money Capital and Productive Capital during the Depression, Changes in the Character of Crises, Cartels and Crises. Part 5 of the book is titled The Economic Policy of Finance Capital, with the headings The Reorientation of Commercial Policy, The Export of Capital and the Struggle for Economic Territory, Finance Capital and Classes, The Conflict over the Labor Contract, The Proletariat and Imperialism. Acknowledgements. The publisher and the editor are grateful to the late Professor David Spitz, who was the literary executor of Professor Morris Watnick, and to Mr. Sam Gordon and the Monthly Review Press for permission to make use of the translations which were in their possession, and to Rudolf Hilferding's son, Dr. Peter Milford, for his permission to publish this English edition. I am also grateful to Dr. Milford for his advice on some matters concerning the translation, and especially for the additional information and extensive comments which he provided in connection with my introduction. He is not, of course, in any way responsible for the interpretation of Hilferding's theories and political views which I have presented. After the death of Professor David Spitz in April 1979, his widow, Professor Elaine Spitz, was kind enough to send me the manuscript material on Hilferding, which formed part of Morris Watnick's literary estate, and I have acknowledged my use of this material more fully in the introduction. The English version of a passage from Aristophanes' The Frogs, translated by David Barrett, is reprinted on page 381-2 by permission of the publisher, Penguin Books. Finally, I should like to express my very great appreciation of the work of my secretary, Eileen Plume, and of Pat Bennett, who between them produced, with great accuracy and dispatch, an excellent typescript from a much revised and untidy original. Tom Bottomore. Introduction to the translation. Section 1. When Rudolf Hilferding's Finance Capital first appeared in 1910, it was at once recognized as a major original contribution to Marxist economic theory. Otto Bauer, in a review published in Der Kampf, observed that the book could almost be regarded as a further volume of Marx's Capital, in which Marx's bold anticipations of the concentration of capital and the next stage in the development of the capitalist economy were shown to correspond with the real course of events in the period since his death. Let me get to the end notes here. It's just a citation. Similarly, Karl Kautsky, in a long essay in Die Neue Zeit, described the work as a continuation of Marx's Capital, a brilliant demonstration of the fruitfulness of the Marxist method, applied particularly in a study of those phenomena which Marx himself, in the unfinished second and third volumes of Capital, had not succeeded in investigating or analyzing fully. Somewhat later, Lenin based his study of imperialism upon Hilferding's, quote, very valuable theoretical analysis, end quote, and distinguished the principal features of imperialism: monopolies, finance, capital, export of capital, formation of international cartels, territorial division of the world, in terms which were obviously derived from Hilferding's work. Nikolai Bukharin, who was the most talented of the Bolshevik social theorists, particularly in the economic field, showed his indebtedness to Rudolf Hilferding's work in a number of his own writings. Footnote: Bukharin had come into contact with the Austro-Marxist school during his stay in Vienna between 1912 and 1914, and it was during this time that he wrote his first book, An Attack on the Austrian Marginalist Economic Theory, the Economic Theory of the Leisure Class. Stephen Cohen, in his biographical study, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution, observes that, quote, Austro-Marxism, particularly in Hilferding's Finance Capital, was to have a lasting influence on Bukharin, end quote. And that even after 1917, when the Austro-Marxists were dismissed as, quote, reformists, quote, Bukharin retained a grudging admiration for their theoretical achievements, end quote. Cohen. End footnote. In Imperialism and World Economy by Bukharin, which was completed some months before Lenin's study and was used by Lenin, Bukharin's, quote, starting point and essential inspiration, end quote, was finance capital. But Bukharin presented Hilferding's theory in a more intransigent way by insisting that, quote, finance capital cannot pursue any policy other than an imperialist one, end quote, Bukharin, leading inevitably to war, and also extending it by arguing that the structural changes in capitalism had resulted in a system of, quote, state capitalism, in which an interventionist state acquired immense new powers, regulating and, quote, militarizing the whole economy. This conception of modern capitalism underlay much of Bukharin's subsequent work, including his well-known book, The Economics of the Transformation Period, published in 1920, and as will be seen later, it had some affinities with Hilferding's notion of, quote, organized capitalism, although its political significance was conceived in a different way. It was Hilferding's theory of imperialism, set out in the first part of his book, which had the greatest immediate influence, as may be seen not only from the response of Marxist thinkers, but also from attention which a critic such as Joseph Schumpeter gave to it in his references to the Austro-Marxist school. Finance Capital, the book, however, contained many other new conceptions, dealing with the nature of modern capitalism, the class structure of the state, and working class politics, which Hilferding continued to develop and revise in his later writings, and before embarking upon a closer examination of its principal themes, It will be useful to set the book in the context of Hilferding's life and work as a whole. Rudolf Hilferding, new section. Rudolf Hilferding was born on the 10th of August, 1877 in Vienna, the only son of Emil Hilferding, who was chief cashier at the, quote, Alliance, an old established insurance company, and of Anna Hilferding, née Liss. After attending the Staatsgymnasium in District 2 of Vienna, Leopoldstadt, he entered the University of Vienna to study medicine, obtaining his doctorate in 1901. After graduating, he practiced as a doctor at least until 1906 and again during his military service in the First World War, but he also devoted much of his time to economic studies, in which he had been interested since joining the Association of Socialist Students at the age of 15. He began to write on economic and social questions while still at university, and some of his earliest articles appeared in Le Mouvement Socialiste in Paris in 1899 to 1900. From 1902, Hilferding was a frequent contributor on economic subjects to Die Neue Zeit, the leading Marxist theoretical journal of that period, edited by Karl Kautsky, and he became more widely known when he published in 1904 his rejoinder to Böhm-Bawerk's criticism of Marx's economic theory. And that rejoinder is on this channel. Footnote: Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk lived from 1851 to 1914 and was a leading representative of the Austrian marginalist school of economics and a vigorous opponent of socialism, who published his critical study of Marxian economics under the title Zum Abschluss des Marxischen Systems in 1896. Hilferding's reply, Böhm-Bawerk's Marxkritik, appeared in the first volume of Marxstudien, Vienna, 1904. Böhm-Bawerk's study and Hilferding's rejoinder have been published together in English translation in a volume edited and introduced by Paul Sweezy. And that whole volume's on this channel. End footnote. At this time, Hilferding was also engaged in establishing with Max Adler the Marxstudien, published irregularly from 1904 to 1923, which were intended to provide a means of expression for Austrian socialism and for the newly emerging Austrian version of Marxist theory. Shortly afterwards, in 1906, he was invited to become a lecturer in economics at the Social Democratic Party School in Berlin, but had to give up this position when the appointment of aliens as lecturers was prohibited, and then became the foreign editor of Vorwärts. From 1907, he contributed frequently, sometimes under the pseudonym Karl Emil, to Der Kampf, the newly established monthly journal of the Austrian Social Democratic Party, and he was also engaged during this period in completing his major work, Finance Capital. In 1904, Hilferding married Margareta Königsberg, also a doctor, whom he had first met in the socialist student movement, and had two sons, Karl Emil, who lived from 1905 to 1942, and Peter, born in 1908, but later divorced and remarried. So I guess Peter was still alive at the time of this publication. On the outbreak of the First World War, Hilferding associated himself with the minority in the German party who opposed the voting of war credits. He was mobilized as a doctor in the Austrian army in 1915 and spent the rest of the war on the Italian front. Immediately after the war, he was invited back to Berlin by the leaders of the Independent Social Democratic Party as editor of the journal Freiheit. Footnote: Unabhängige Sozialdemokratische Partei Deutschlands. This new party was created in April 1917 at a conference in Gotha, attended by all the social democratic opposition groups and numbered among its leading members Besides Hilferding, Hugo Hasse, Karl Kautsky, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Liebknecht, Edward Bernstein, Franz Mehring, and Kurt Eisner. For a brief account of the foundation and subsequent dissolution of the party, see Julius Braunthal's History of the International, Volume 2. And footnote. Hilferding opposed affiliation of the party with the Third International, took part in the discussions which led to the creation of the, quote, Second and a Half International, and eventually rejoined the majority German Social Democratic Party after its reunification in 1922. Having acquired Prussian citizenship in 1920, Hilferding was appointed to the Reich Economic Council, became Minister of Finance from August to October 1923 in the coalition of Gustav Stresemann, and again Minister of Finance from June 1928 until December 1929 in the government of Hermann Müller. He was elected to the Reichstag in 1924 and remained a member until 1933. During this time, he also edited the journal Die Gesellschaft, to which he contributed many articles, and he took a prominent part in the activities of the Social Democratic Party. After Hitler's accession to power, Hilferding went into exile, initially in Denmark, then in Zurich. He participated actively in the work of the Social Democratic Party while it was in exile in Czechoslovakia and contributed frequently to the socialist press. In 1938, he went to Paris, where he joined his friend Rudolf Breitscheid, and after the collapse of France in 1940, they moved to the unoccupied zone, living at the Hotel Forum in Arles, or Arles, A-R-L-E-S. Here, Hilferding began to write his last work, a reassessment of the materialist conception of history entitled Das Historische Problem. But on the 11th of February 1941, the Pétain government yielded finally to repeated demands from the German authorities, handed Breitscheid and Hilferding over to the SS liaison officer Hugo Geisler in Vichy. They were then taken to Paris, where Hilferding either committed suicide or more probably was murdered after being tortured by the Gestapo. Footnote: the exact date and manner of Hilferding's death remain uncertain, and so far as I can discover, no organization in Germany or elsewhere has ever made any serious attempt to investigate it or to identify and bring to justice those who are responsible. That might be different nowadays. It looks like he died 11th of February 1941, at least according to Wikipedia. Yeah. The reason I said they probably did research because I know that, if you don't know, Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Israel, made it one of their purposes to document every person who was murdered in the Holocaust. I think that was a later effort, or it took time to do so. Anyway. Section 3. As I've indicated, Hilferding published articles on economic questions in Die Neue Zeit from 1902 onwards, but his first major contribution to Marxist economic theory was his defense of that theory against the criticisms of Böhm-Bawerk. The context in which this work would be seen is the general aim of the Austro-Marxist school of thinkers to engage in critical debate with the representatives of new currents of thought in philosophy and the social sciences, and more specifically to counter the influence of the, quote, revisionists in the socialist movement. Footnote. For a brief account of this school, see Tom Bottomore and Patrick Good's edited volume, Austro-Marxism. I know Patrick Good also wrote a book on Karl Korsch. Footnote. See Otto Bauer's article, What is Austro-Marxism?, published in Bottomore and Good. Bauer notes particularly that the Austro-Marxists, quote, had to come to terms with the so-called Austrian school of political economy, end quote, that is, with the marginalist school whose leading thinkers besides Böhm-Bawerk were Karl Menger, who lived from 1840 to 1921, and Friedrich von Wieser, who lived from 1851 to 1926. The first substantial Austro-Marxist criticism of the marginalist theory had been made by Gustav Eckstein in an article, Der vierfache Wurzel des Satzes vom unzureichenden Gründe der Grenznutztheorie, published in Die Neue Zeit, 1901 to 1902. End footnote. Footnote. Peter Gay, The Dilemma of Democratic Socialism, notes that the marginalist analysis of value, which is also formulated independently by an English economist, William Stanley Jevons, acquired great influence among the Fabian socialists to whom Edward Bernstein was indebted for many of his ideas. Bernstein himself came to believe that both the Marxist and the marginalist concepts of value contained part of the truth and hinted vaguely at a synthesis of the two, but in the main he favored the second, saying that, quote, we search for the laws of price formation more directly today and avoid the detour of the convolutions of that metaphysical thing, quote, value, end quote, end quote. Peter Gay. Bernstein, cited in Peter Gay, End footnote. Hilferding's principal thesis is that Marx's theory of value rests upon a concept of, quote, society and, quote, social relations, whereas the marginalist theory begins with individuals. In the first chapter of the book, after noting that, quote, the analysis of the commodity constitutes the starting point of the Marxist system, end quote, he goes on to say that, quote, the term commodity, is the expression of social relationships between mutually independent producers insofar as these relationships are effected through the instrumentality of goods, end quote. Hilferding. Hence, quote, the object of political economy is the social aspect of the commodity, of the good, insofar as it is a symbol of social interconnection, end quote. Hilferding. On the other hand, quote, every theory of value which starts from use value, that is to say, from the natural qualities of the thing, whether from its finished form as a useful thing or from its function, the satisfaction of a want starts from the individual relationship between a thing and a human being, instead of from the social relationships of human beings with each other. This involves the error of attempting to derive an objective social measure from the subjective individual relationship. In the second chapter on value and average profit, Hilferding replies to Böhm-Bawerk's specific criticisms of Marx's argument in the third volume of Capital. Footnote. The publication of Capital Volume 3 in 1894 provided the occasion for Böhm-Bawerk's study. End footnote. According to Böhm-Bawerk, the theory of the average rate of profit and the prices of production cannot be reconciled with the theory of value. There is a fundamental contradiction in Marx's system. I shall not attempt here to summarize Hilferding's counter-criticisms, but only state his general argument, which is that value is, quote, the necessary theoretical starting point from which we can elucidate the peculiar phenomenon of prices resulting from capitalist competition, end quote. And that the, quote, law of value, end quote, does govern the transformation of value into price of production in a long historical process. Finally, in the third chapter, Hilferding sums up his argument and formulates his own criticism of the marginalist school. quote, the law of value becomes a law of motion for a definite type of social organization based upon the production of commodities. For in the last resort, all change in social structure can be referred to changes in the relationships of production. That is to say, to changes in the evolution of productive power and in the organization of productive labor, end quote. Hilferding. On the other hand, quote, the representative of the psychological school of political economy, Bumbawerk, fails to see this social nexus, and he therefore necessarily misunderstands a theory which specifically aims to disclose the social determinism of economic phenomena, a theory whose starting point, therefore, is society and not the individual, end quote. Hilferding. The publication of Bumbawerk's Marx critique, which is probably still, as Paul Sweezy once claimed, quote, the best criticism of subjective value theory from the Marxist standpoint, end quote, was a first step in Hilferding's elaboration of a Marxist theory of the development of modern capitalism. In the years following 1904, he published numerous articles and reviews on economic questions in Die Neue Zeit, and at the same time worked on finance capital, the main structure of which, as he claims in his preface, was substantially completed by 1906. In Finance Capital, Hilferding analyzes more thoroughly, in the light of recent changes in the capitalist economy, a number of problems which had been treated very briefly, or only referred to by Marx in the second and third volumes of Capital. The work is conceived and presented, therefore, as a development of Marx's theory, in which several new conceptions are formulated. Hilferding begins with a discussion of money and credit, then examines the growth of joint stock companies and cartels, analyzes the phenomena of economic crisis, and finally outlines a theory of imperialism. Perhaps the least successful part of the book is that which deals with the theory of money. Few later writers have paid much attention to it, and Schumpeter dismissed it laconically and somewhat cryptically as offering a, quote, rather old-fashioned monetary theory, end quote. Footnote. See J.A. Schumpeter's History of Economic Analysis. Undoubtedly, more parts of Hilferding's analysis would need to be reconsidered today. For example, his rejection of the possibility of a, quote, pure paper currency, end quote, in his insistence upon the need for gold in international transactions, and his underestimation of the role of consumer credit. But these later developments in the functioning of money do not necessarily invalidate the underlying principles of his theory. Schumpeter's comment seems less than just, for in his own review of the theories of money, in Chapter 8, he suggests that there was little progress in theoretical understanding during the period under consideration, up to Keynes, and some of the theories he singles out for criticism had already been criticized by Hilferding, that of Knapp, for instance. Moreover, even today the theory of money remains one of the least satisfactory parts of economic theory, as may easily be seen from the confusion and controversy which prevail in discussions of inflation. It is arguable, I think, that it is arguable, I think, that what is needed in order to form an adequate conception of money is a social rather than a narrowly economic theory. One such theory which provides the starting point for Hilferding's analysis is, of course, Marxism. Another, not wholly unrelated, is that to be found in Georg Simmel's The Philosophy of Money. End footnote. Nevertheless, this part of Hilferding's study has at least two important features. In the first place, it is one of the very few attempts to develop further a Marxist theory of money, in the course of which Hilferding also makes a brief comment on the role of money in a socialist economy. Footnote. For a more recent Marxist discussion of this question, see Ernest Mandel, Marxist Economic Theory. End footnote. Second, the analysis of, quote, credit money is an essential preliminary to Hilferding's account of the dominant position of the banks in the recent development of capitalism. Footnote. As he writes at the beginning of Chapter 4, quote, only the hope that by this means can we discover the secret of how the processes of circulation themselves endow capitalist credit with the power eventually to dominate the whole social process, can give the reader courage to traverse patiently the, quote, stations of the cross, end quote, in the present chapter, end quote. End footnote. Only after this analysis of money and credit does Hilferding embark upon the main themes of his study, which are the increasing concentration and centralization of capital in large corporations, the formation of cartels and trusts, the role of banks, and finally the economic and political consequences of these changes in the structure of the capitalist economy. The most important economic aspect of the growth of corporations is the, quote, liberation of the industrial capitalist from the function of industrial entrepreneur, end quote. Hilferding. This transformation has several consequences. One is the emergence of, quote, promoter's profit, end quote, Gründergewinn, which arises from the possibility of selling shares in a newly formed joint stock company for considerably more than the capital already invested in the enterprise, if the yield on that capital is higher than the current rate of interest on investments. Promoter's profit is not only an incentive to the formation of joint stock companies, but also a source of considerable wealth which becomes available for further investment. In both ways, it stimulates the centralization of capital, the growth of giant corporations, and eventually of cartels and trusts controlling whole industries. Footnote. Hilferding also makes clear, however, that the concentration and centralization of capital is strongly affected by technological progress, which makes necessary much larger capital investments. End footnote. Hilferding could rightly claim that his analysis of the tendencies in modern capitalism went considerably beyond Marx's own brief comments on joint stock companies. By treating dividends and promoters' profit as distinct economic categories, and by working out more fully the significance of the separation between the ownership and the control of production, which allows a small number of people to acquire control over a large number of companies and to establish personal connections which then facilitate the formation of cartels and trusts. What has been most criticized in Hilferding's analysis is his attribution of a dominant role in this process to bank capital, a notion which is summed up in his remark that, quote, taking possession of 6 large Berlin banks would mean taking possession of the most important spheres of large-scale industry, end quote. Hilferding. This thesis was contested very soon after his book first appeared. An equally critical view was taken subsequently by Edward Hyman and Paul Sweezy, among others. Footnote. See Edward Hyman's book, History of Economic Doctrines. End footnote. Footnote. See Paul Sweezy's The Theory of Capitalist Development. Sweezy argues that, quote, Hilferding mistakes a transitional phase of capitalist development for a lasting trend, end quote, and suggests that once the large monopolistic corporations are well established, they can rely upon their own internally generated funds for further growth, and thus become less dependent upon the banks. He therefore proposes a more appropriate term to describe this latest stage of capitalism, quote, monopoly capital, end quote, rather than, quote, finance capital, end quote. Sweezy. End footnote. Hilferding himself seems to have introduced some qualification of his thesis later on by characterizing finance capital not as the, quote, final stage of capitalism, end quote, but as a condition preceding the emergence of, quote, organized capitalism, end quote. Footnote. See Hilferding's 1931 article, Gesellschaftsmacht oder Privatmacht über die Wirtschaft. End footnote. It has sometimes been claimed that Hilferding's analysis was based too exclusively upon the experience of Germany and Austria and took too little account of the different relationship between the banks and industry in other capitalist countries. But Edward Merz, in his introduction to the new German edition of Finance Capital, published in 1968, argues that while critics of Hilferding's thesis may have been right on particular points, the substance of his thesis remains unaffected. For the banks did play an important part in the development of industry from the mid-19th century onwards, especially in the relatively backward countries of Central Europe, and there did in fact grow up the close personal and organizational links between industrial and bank capital, which Hilferding describes as, quote, finance capital. Footnote. Even in this case, a number of critics, among them Rieser, pointed out that in several leading German industries, bank capital had never had a dominant role. End footnote. Footnote. In Austria, particularly, the connection between the banks and industry were extremely close, as is shown in the recent work by Bernard Michel, Banque et Banquière, in Utrecht au début du 20th century. I don't know how to say that word. I don't know how to say numbers in French. I don't know how to say anything in French, but I can't even stumble my way. Can't even sound out the Roman numerals. See also the comments of Edward Merz in his introduction to the new German edition of Finance Capital of 1968. It is also worth noting here that Hilferding himself in chapter 21 particularly explicitly draws attention to the substantial differences between Germany and Britain with regard to the role of the banks. Furthermore, in the course of his discussion, he comments on some related aspects of the development of British capitalism, which still seem highly relevant to Britain's continuing industrial decline in the late 20th century. End footnote. Another recent writer has argued that in the case of American capitalism, too, which Sweezy, for example, contrasted with European capitalism, for many years, quote, the outstanding feature, ... was undoubtedly the, quote, empires of high finance, end quote. And in these empires, the bankers undoubtedly played a dominant and organizing role, end quote. And that quote is from Michael Barrett Brown, After Imperialism. It is only quite recently, perhaps, that the situation described by Hilferding at the beginning of this century has begun to change significantly. Edward Merz suggested that a decline in the power of finance capital in Western Europe since 1945 can be attributed to the nationalization of many banks in the European countries, and to the greatly enlarged role of the state in promoting and financing industrial development. On the other hand, Michael Barrett Brown observes that the, quote, banker's role is now more a partnership with finance directors of the giant companies, and the bankers themselves have become most important as intermediaries between the companies and the state. What the finance groups did before to coordinate the movements of private capital in an otherwise anarchic market, the bankers do now to coordinate the otherwise unplanned allocations of state funds and unplanned international trade and investment, end quote. Barrett Brown. Wait, hold on, I think I lost my spot here. Anyway, I'll reread. I might have to reread something. On the other hand, Michael Barrett Brown observes that the, quote, banker's role is now more a partnership with the finance directors of giant companies, and the bankers themselves have become most important as intermediaries between companies and the state. What the finance groups did before to coordinate bank movements of private capital in an otherwise anarchic market, the bankers do now to coordinate the otherwise unplanned allocation of state funds and unplanned international trade investment, end quote. Barrett Brown. On this interpretation, the interventionist state, however greatly its own power has grown, still has to deal with other powers, especially the multinational corporations and the international bankers, themselves closely associated with the influence of finance capital, and the influence of finance capital remains far from negligible. The conclusions which Hilferding in the later chapters of his book drew from his analysis of finance capital and of the general tendency towards an ever greater centralization of capital were brought together under two heads, the theory of economic crises and the theory of imperialism. In his discussion of the causes of crises, Hilferding makes clear that he regards the general condition responsible for crises as being the restricted consumption which lies at the base of capitalist production, but he goes on to remark that, quote, such expressions as, quote, overproduction of commodities, end quote, and, quote, underconsumption, end quote, tell us very little, end quote. And he therefore proceeds to examine the more specific causes suggested by Marx in the second volume of Capital, in particular the disproportionality which arises between the capital goods and consumer goods industries. After presenting this, quote, disproportionality, end quote, theory, Hilferding considers the changes in the character of crises which are brought about by the growth of cartels. Footnote. From a quite different theoretical standpoint, Tugendbaranovsky in his book Studien zur Theorie und Geschichte der Handelskrisen in England, in Russian in 1894, the German version 1901, also outlined a, quote, disproportionality, end quote, theory. He and Hilferding were both vigorously criticized in due course by the, quote, orthodox, Bolshevik, and Marxists as, quote, revisionists and, quote, reformists. For example, Sweezy, the theory of capitalist development. But this kind of criticism is of little interest today after the disintegration of, quote, orthodox Marxism itself. In any case, Hilferding made very clear his own disagreements with Tugendbaranovsky. In his view, cartels cannot prevent the emergence of disproportional relations, but they can shift the main burden of a crisis onto non-cartelized industries, and in a more general way they introduce a measure of planning and overall control into the capitalist economy. One can see in this discussion the germs of Hilferding's later conception of, quote, organized capitalism, end quote, which I shall examine in the next section. The theory of imperialism initially attracted more attention than any other part of Hilferding's work, and it was also the most significant in providing a general view of his political ideas. Its main argument is easily presented. The development of monopolies and cartels leads to a new form of protectionism designed to restrict or eliminate foreign competition in the domestic market. Monopoly prices, however, tend to reduce domestic sales, and in order to maintain and extend large-scale production, exports become increasingly important. At the same time, a new kind of expansionism emerges with the export of capital, which extends the economic region and the scale of production, and by developing production in areas where labor is very cheap, helps to maintain a high rate of profit. Such expansion requires the support and active intervention of the state in acquiring and maintaining control over the new economic areas, often by colonial conquest, and it leads eventually to national expansionist policies and an intensification of conflict among the major capitalist states. Nationalism itself, Hilferding argues, is transformed from a doctrine of national independence, cultural autonomy, and self-determination into the idea of world domination. It becomes the ideology of imperialism. Schumpeter, in his early essay on imperialism, attributes considerable value to Austro-Marxist theory and concludes his exposition by saying, quote, "Thus we have here, within a social group, bracket, the entrepreneurs, in bracket, that carries great political weight, a strong undeniable economic interest in such things as protective tariffs, cartels, monopoly prices, forced exports, dumping, an aggressive economic policy, and aggressive foreign policy generally, and war, including wars of expansion with a typically imperialist character," end quote. Schumpeter. Footnote. Otto Bauer made an important contribution upon which Hilferding draws in his book Die Nationalitätenfrage und die Sozialdemokratie, published in 1907. End footnote. But Schumpeter also argues that there are countervailing tendencies and that imperialism is not a, quote, necessary stage of capitalism, end quote. Hilferding clearly did conceive it as a necessary stage, indeed as the, quote, final stage of capitalism, but his interpretations of its significance differed considerably from some other Marxists. Unlike Bukharin, Hilferding did not regard war as an inevitable outcome of imperialist rivalries, but pointed to the various forces opposed to militarism and war, prominent among them the socialist movement itself, and his general view of the transition to socialism widely diverged from the sequence outlined in Bukharin's book, Imperialism and World Economy: Monopoly Capitalism, then Imperialism, then War, then Proletarian Revolution. Footnote. It may be claimed that the First World War showed that Hilferding had entertained illusions in this respect. But still it should be noted that while he did not accept the idea of the inevitability of war, he did emphasize very strongly the inherent drive toward war and the particular danger of an armed conflict between Britain and Germany. End footnote. Footnote. See Cohen's book, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution, page 27, where this difference is brought out clearly. End footnote. Hilferding's conception was also very different from that of Rosa Luxemburg, who presented in The Accumulation of Capital an account of imperialism which was intended to provide an explanation of capitalist economic expansion and to reveal the point at which this expansion would cease and capitalism would inevitably collapse. In Hilferding's view, the, quote, collapse of capitalism will be political and social, not economic, end quote. And in the final part of Finance Capital, the book, as well as in his subsequent writings, Hilferding devotes his attention to the diverse social and political tendencies connected with the economic changes which can be discerned in modern capitalism. He argues first that the monopolies and cartels have introduced some degree of regulation and planning into the economy, and this, quote, socialization effected by finance capital has made it enormously easier to overcome capitalism, end quote. Hilferding. The socialization of the economy has been reinforced by the greatly enhanced role of the state. There has been, he says, a, quote, complete change in the relationship of the bourgeoisie to the state, end quote, and a growing desire to strengthen the state. With this development of the interventionist state, there must come, Hilferding argues, a change in the attitude of the socialist movement toward the state. It is no longer a question of, quote, smashing the bourgeois state as a purely repressive apparatus, but of taking it over and extending its role in planning and controlling socialized production. Footnote. This became the general standpoint of the Austro-Marxists. Karl Renner, for example, who noted in his essay on Probleme des Marxismus in 1916 how the war economy had strengthened these tendencies, wrote that, quote, our opponents, ... are bewildered by the idea that the sovereign state now has the function of selling potatoes and trading in livestock, end quote. And that, quote, we demand and our opponents contest the new tasks, end quote. For an English translation of excerpts from these essays, see Bottomore and Patrick Good's edited volume, Austro-Marxism. End footnote. Hilferding may have exaggerated somewhat when he said that, quote, taking possession of 6 large Berlin banks, ... would mean taking possession of the most important spheres of large-scale industry, end quote. But it is in fact the case that the development of the capitalist welfare states since the Second World War has depended very largely upon gaining control of the, quote, commanding heights, end quote, of the economy in this sense, and that any further advance toward democratic socialism in the Western societies can only follow the same course. Footnote. This term was used by Otto Bauer in his essay on fascism from 1938, and it came to be very widely employed after 1945. End footnote. And the term being referred to is commanding heights. Anyway, end footnote. Hilferding also explores the conditions of working class political struggle in relation to the changes in the class structure and to imperialism. Hilferding notes that the small producers have become increasingly hostile to the working class, but that the salaried employees, although they are still firmly allied with the bourgeoisie, may change their political allegiance in the future as they begin to suffer economically from monopoly prices and from high taxes necessary to finance national expansion. And he discusses more generally the possibility of finding allies for the working class movement in the middle class, in terms which have a very modern ring. Footnote. It may be claimed indeed that Hilferding set the stage for all subsequent discussion up to the present time of the political significance of the, quote, new middle class, end quote, although he disliked this particular term in relation to the labor movement. End footnote. At the same time, however, Hilferding observes that the growth of salaried employment has created a new hierarchical system which helps to sustain the bourgeois social order. Quote, the interest in a career, the drive for advancement which develops in every hierarchy, is thus kindled in each individual employee and triumphs over his feelings of solidarity. Everyone hopes to rise above the others and to work his way out of his semi-proletarian condition to the heights of capitalist income. End quote. Hilferding. The protectionist and expansionist policies of finance capital, Hilferding shows, are fundamentally detrimental to the working class, increasing the power of employers' organizations, raising the cost of living, imposing the heavy burden of taxation, weakening democracy, strengthening an ideology which glorifies force, and tending to produce an armed conflict between capitalist states in which workers would be the principal sufferers, even though, from another aspect, finance capital creates economic preconditions for a socialist society. Hence, working class politics should express an implacable hostility to militarism and to belligerent foreign policies. There is no suggestion in Hilferding's analysis that imperialist war is to be considered the most favorable occasion for the overthrow of capitalism. On the contrary, it is in a successful struggle against expansionist policies and preparations for war that the working class has the best chance of attaining a socialist society. Since the first decade and a half of this century, when Hilferding, Luxemburg, Bukharin, and Lenin wrote their studies of imperialism, no major revision of Marxist theory has been undertaken, although the characteristics of imperialism have changed considerably. It may be doubted indeed whether a new theory of imperialism, which followed closely the mainstream of Marxist thought on the subject, could any longer comprehend adequately these characteristics. For although there is still capitalist imperialism, or what is sometimes called, quote, neo-imperialism, after the dissolution of the colonial empires, the competition among capitalist states has been very highly and largely successfully regulated since the end of the Second World War, and the threat of armed conflict among capitalist states is one of the least of the dangers which humanity now faces. On the other side, it is evident that expansionist policies are being pursued by states which are not capitalist, and some of the most acute conflicts of the present time arise between states which claim to be socialist and to be guided by Marxist doctrine. The situation in the late 19th century thus lends some credibility both to Schumpeter's view that imperialism is not a necessary feature of capitalism, and to the later Austro-Marxist conception formulated particularly by Karl Renner of, quote, social imperialism, end quote, or the imperialism of a whole people, which is an outgrowth of extreme nationalism. And there's a footnote here that I think I missed. Oh no. New section, section 4. From the very beginning of his career, Hilferding, like other Austro-Marxists, was deeply involved in party politics, first in Austria and subsequently for the greater part of his adult life in Germany. Footnote. No comprehensive major study of Hilferding's life and work has yet been published. I think that's changed since the time this was written. In the following brief account, I have drawn upon the work by Wilfried Gottschalk, Strukturveränderungen der Gesellschaft und politisches Handeln in der Lehre von Rudolf Hilferding, which provides much information about Hilferding's political career, but I have also consulted numerous other sources which are cited at relevant points below and are also listed in the bibliography. In addition, through the kindness of the late Professor David Spitz and of his widow, Professor Elaine Spitz, I have been able to look at the extensive manuscript material which Morris Watnick had prepared with a view to writing an introduction to finance capital, and this has helped me considerably both in tracing sources and in interpreting Hilferding's political views. Finally, I have been benefited greatly from Dr. Peter Milford's detailed comments on the first draft of my introduction. I should emphasize, however, that none of the people I have mentioned bear any responsibility for the eventual judgments on Hilferding's politics which I express here. End footnote. After participating in the student socialist movement and the Social Democratic Party and helping to found the Studien, I don't know how to say it. Let's see. Studien. Marx Studien. After participating in the student socialist movement and the Social Democratic Party and helping to found the Marx Studien in Vienna, he became in 1906 the foreign editor of Vorwärts in Berlin and was active in the leadership of the German Social Democratic Party. In the period up to 1914, three main groups could be distinguished in the SPD, quote, revisionists, quote, left radicals, and, quote, centrists. And Hilferding associated himself with the, quote, centrists, particularly closely linked with Karl Kautsky. Footnote, see his letters to Kautsky from 1902 to 1937, deposited in the International Institute of Social History, Amsterdam. Thus, in the debates about the mass strike which took place from 1904 on, Hilferding supported the position of the, quote, centrist, arguing that the political mass strike was a weapon of last resort, either as a defense of the working class movement against bourgeois violence, or as a means to be used in the final stage of the struggle for socialism, and at the same time emphasizing the importance of electoral politics and parliamentary action. After his war service as a doctor in the Austrian army, Hilferding returned to Germany, and as I noted earlier, he then became editor of Freiheit, the newspaper of the Independent Social Democratic Party, the USPD. He took an active part in the debate about the workers' councils and about the, quote, socialization program, and was one of the 11 members of the Commission on Socialization of Industry established by the Social Democratic government in November 1918, as well as being a member of the commission which dealt particularly with the socialization of the coal mining industry. Footnote, on, quote, socialization, see Patrick Good's book, Karl Korsch, A Study in Western Marxism, Chapter 2, and F.L. Karsten's book, Revolution in Central Europe, 1918 to 1919, Chapters 5 to 7. And footnote, the report on the coal mining industry seems to have been the only important work which the General Commission accomplished. And footnote. At the same time, Hilferding was engaged in a fierce political controversy inside the USPD in an attempt to maintain the unity of the party and to prepare the way for a reunification of the whole working-class political movement, in opposition to the efforts to create a new communist party affiliated in the Third International. Footnote, see especially Hilferding's speech against Zinoviev at the USPD conference in Halle 1920, published under the title Revolutionäre Politik oder Machtillusionen. End footnote. In 1921, Hilferding also took part in the founding of the Second and a Half International, which was a further attempt to reunite the labor movement strongly supported by many of the Austrian Marxists. Footnote, the importance of unity in the labor movement was strongly emphasized by Otto Bauer at a later date in his essay titled, What is Austro-Marxism? Published in, see Bottomore and Good. End footnote. The most active period of Hilferding's political career extends from 1921 when he became a member of the Reich Economic Council, in 1933, during which time he was a member of the Reichstag, from 1924 and finance minister in 2 German governments. It is difficult in the present state of knowledge to assess Hilferding's policies or achievements as finance minister. Footnote, the recent publication of the minutes of Hermann Müller's cabinet makes available a useful source for an eventual study of Hilferding's second term of office. There are short accounts of his work as finance minister in Gottschalk and in E. Eich's book, Geschichte der Weimarer Republik, Volume 2, Chapter 18, on which I have drawn here. End footnote. On the first occasion in the government of Gustav Stresemann, he was in office only for 7 weeks, from the middle of August to the beginning of October 1923, and had no opportunity to implement his policies. During September, however, he did work out a plan for currency reform involving the introduction of a Rentenmark backed by gold, and he insisted that the successful introduction of a new currency to halt inflation also depended upon ending the reckless financing of the passive resistance to the French and Belgian occupation of the Ruhr. On the second occasion, Hilferding was finance minister in the government of Hermann Müller from 1928 to December 1929. By this time, the financial difficulties of the German state had increased enormously, largely through the incompetence of previous governments, and as Schumpeter wrote, quote, "We now have a socialist minister who faces the exceptionally difficult task of curing or improving a situation bequeathed by non-socialist financial policies," end quote. Schumpeter. Hilferding was criticized by some commentators for not undertaking a major reform of public finance, but he considered this impossible until the problem of reparations had been solved. On the other hand, Hilferding saw clearly that in the immediate situation an increase in taxes was necessary, but his proposals encountered strong opposition even within his own party and were not approved. Finally, in December 1929, while the Ministry of Finance was engaged in negotiations for a loan with an American banking group, the president of the Reichsbank, Hjalmar Schacht, published a memorandum in which he criticized vehemently the government's policies and demanded emergency measures, whereupon Hilferding resigned. During these years and in the following period up to 1933, Hilferding and the other SPD leaders had also to confront extremely difficult and dangerous political problems arising from the economic depression and the rapidly increasing strength of the National Socialist Party. In 1928, as Julius Braunthal writes, quote, "German social democracy was at the height of its powers," end quote, having won more than 9 million votes in the Reichstag elections of May 1928 and emerged as by far the strongest party. But, quote, only 2 years later it was locked in a life-and-death struggle with the National Socialists, end quote, who had vastly increased their vote in September 1930 elections. In the September 1930 elections, and had now become the second largest party in the Reichstag. Much criticism has since been directed against the policy of the SPD leadership after 1930, which involved, quote, accepting the lesser evil, end quote, that is to say, supporting Brüning's presidential government, which ruled by emergency decrees, as the only alternative to a government which would be either directly or indirectly under Hitler's control and would destroy all democratic rights. Footnote: see the discussion in Braunthal. The policy was strongly opposed by the left wing in the party, grouped around the journal Der Klassenkampf. Max Adler, who was one of the editors of this journal, belonged to the left-wing group in the Austrian party. See his comments on the German situation in his essay titled Metamorphosis of the Working Class, published in 1933. End footnote. Much criticism has since been directed against the policy of the SPD leadership after 1930, which involved, quote, accepting the lesser evil, end quote, that is to say, supporting Brüning's presidential government, which ruled by emergency decrees as the only alternative to a government which would be either directly or indirectly under Hitler's control and would destroy all democratic rights. What has been most sharply criticized, however, is the policy which the SPD leadership pursued after the events of June-July 1932, in which Hindenburg dismissed Brüning, dissolved the Reichstag, and removed the ban on the Nazi paramilitary formations SA and SS, and declared a state of emergency in Berlin and Brandenburg, when they continued to uphold this idea of, quote, legal opposition, end quote, and rest their hopes in a decline of National Socialist support by the time of the next Reichstag elections. But what was the alternative? The Social Democratic leaders, Braunthal writes, quote, shrank in deadly fear from the prospects of the carnage of civil war, end quote. They were, quote, profoundly convinced that democracy and the Weimar Republic would be destroyed in a civil war, and the advance of the working classes would be held up for decades, end quote. There is no doubt that Hilferding fully shared these convictions, which were in any case those of the Austro-Marxists generally. Footnote: Otto Bauer, in his report to the Fourth Congress of the Labor and Socialist International in July 1931, reiterated in the context of the rise of fascism in Germany and Austria his doctrine of, quote, defensive violence, end quote, saying, quote, "We do not want socialism to come out of a bloody civil war. We do not want it to come as the result of another war among nations and countries. We do not want socialism to emerge out of a sea of blood upon the ruins of civilization. We want the road of democracy to socialism and to use the methods of democracy to achieve socialism," end quote. Quoted in Brownthal, page 364. I've discussed this aspect of Austro-Marxist doctrine in my introduction to Bottomore and Good. End footnote. Nevertheless, both the German and Austrian Social Democratic parties accepted the idea of, quote, defensive violence, end quote, a mass strike and armed resistance in certain circumstances, and it may be argued, as Brownthal and others have done, that such tactics would have been more effective in halting the advance of fascism. Footnote. See E. Matthias's article, Social Democracy in the Weimar Republic, published in A. Nichols and E. Matthias's edited volume, German Democracy and the Triumph of Hitler. End footnote. Some critics of the SPD's failure to oppose National Socialism more vigorously have attributed it to a loss of dynamism, resulting in part at least from the reluctance of an aging leadership to give any responsibility to younger elements in the party. And its inability to attract the enthusiastic support of German youth. Footnote. See, for example, Louis J. Edinger's article, German Social Democracy and Hitler's, quote, National Revolution of 1933, A Study in Democratic Leadership, published in 1953. Louis J. Edinger points out that while the average age of the 12 most important SPD leaders, among them Hilferding, was 58, that of the 12 nationalist socialist Reichsfuhrer was 37. By 1931, only 19% of SPD members were under 30, compared with 38% of Nazi Party members. 38% of Nazi Party members. See also the discussion of the problems of, quote, legal opposition, end quote, by Bracher, in Karl Dietrich Bracher, Wolfgang Sauer, and Gerhard Schulze's book, Die Nationalsozialistische Machtergreifung. End footnote. While this may have had some importance along with other influences which were just discussed by Bracher, I think the major factor, certainly in the case of Hilferding, was a profound commitment to democratic socialism and a conviction that preparations for a violent struggle could only hasten the final destruction of the Weimar democracy. This outlook gave rise to an excessive confidence that a legal regime could in fact be maintained, and to Hilferding's interpretation of the substantial fall in the National Socialist vote in the November 1932 election, and the dismissal of the Chancellor von Papen as the first step toward the restoration of a democratic system in which the SPD would once again be able to take its place in the government. Hilferding seemed to have clung to these hopes, though perhaps with growing despair, until finally, in early February 1933, he was obliged to go precipitately into hiding to escape the Gestapo and then flee the country. However, it is also clear, I think, that National Socialism could have been much more effectively opposed at an earlier time without the risk of civil war had it not been for the division in the German working class movement between the SPD and the German Communist Party, KPD, and the policies of the KPD itself. Since 1928, the KPD, by that time completely subservient to the Comintern, that is, to the USSR, had obediently followed Stalin's directive to intensify the struggle against social democracy, which is now referred to as, quote, social fascism, the phenomenal increase in the National Socialist vote in September 1930 did not alarm the KPD leaders. He argued that there was no essential difference between bourgeois democracy and fascist dictatorship, and even as late as April 1932, in the presidential election campaign, Ernst Thälmann declared that the struggle of the KPD was, quote, directed in the first place against the most important counter-revolutionary mass parties, the Social Democratic Party and the Nazi Party, and that, even in this struggle, the main blow must be directed against the Social Democratic Party, end quote. Footnote, quoted in Brownthal. End footnote. It is scarcely surprising in these circumstances that Hilferding, who, like other Austro-Marxists, had long been a vigorous critic of the Soviet dictatorship, shall reply to its representatives in Germany with the argument that the Social Democrats' own struggle against the leadership of the KPD was an essential counterpart of its struggle to restore democracy in Germany by ending the regime of, quote, presidential rule, end quote. Hilferding had opposed the withdrawal of the SPD ministers from the coalition government of 1928 to 30, and Hilferding regarded the outcome of the November 1932 election as opening the way for their renewed participation in government. Gottschalk suggests that Hilferding misinterpreted the social and political situation in Germany during the crisis years and was led into political errors as a result of his theory of, quote, organized capitalism, end quote, which overestimated the capacity of the working class movement to limit and control the economic and political power of the great cartels and the corporations through the machinery of the existing state, and in this way advance gradually and peacefully towards socialism. Hilferding had little opportunity in the years between the First World War and the National Socialist seizure of power to devote himself to any major theoretical study, but in addition to his articles on current economic and political problems, he wrote several important essays in which he developed further some of the ideas adumbrated in Finance Capital, and in particular his notion of, quote, organized capitalism, end quote. This conception involved three main elements. First, that modern capitalism at the national level had succeeded as a result of the economic dominance of the large corporations and the banks, and the changed relation of the bourgeoisie to the state, which had led to extensive state intervention in the economy in introducing a degree of planning into economic life. Second, that such planning had spread to some extent into the international economy, with the consequence that the post-war relations between capitalist nation-states had come to be characterized in Hilferding's view by a, quote, realistic pacifism, end quote. And third, that these developments had necessarily altered the relation of the working class to the state. On this last question, Hilferding argued that in the new democratic system of the Weimar Republic, the task of the working class was to extend democracy by reforming the educational system and the administration of justice, reducing the powers of the President of the Reich, and providing real opportunities for the mass of the people to participate in political life, and at the same time to use its political power to transform an economy organized and planned by the great corporations into one which is planned and controlled by the democratic state. He rejected entirely the idea that the Weimar Republic was a mere, quote, bourgeois democracy, end quote, as well as the facile antithesis between, quote, real and, quote, formal democracy, arguing that socialism had always constituted the core of the democratic movement and was inseparable from democracy. In the essay which I quoted earlier, he had noted, in terms which have become familiar again in recent political analyses, that two options face the working class in, quote, organized capitalism, end quote, either to become assimilated into a more effectively planned but still hierarchical capitalist society capable of assuring high material levels of living, or to advance toward a democratic socialist society, and he returned to this theme again later. It is no doubt possible to interpret Hilferding's conception of, quote, organized capitalism, end quote, in the manner of Gottschalk, as reflecting a purely temporary stabilization of capitalism in the period 1924 to 29, and then attribute the political affairs of the SPD in the following years of crisis to this erroneous theoretical analysis. But if we take a longer view and consider the whole period from the 1920s to the 1970s, it seems to me that Hilferding's general theory should be regarded as substantially correct. Footnote. He quotes here Siegfried Marx's description of Hilferding as the, quote, theorist of coalition politics in the period of capitalist stabilization, end quote. However, Gottschalk does also acknowledge in his concluding discussion that Hilferding succeeded in identifying some important long-term trends in capitalist development. End footnote. But if we take a longer view and consider the whole period from the 1920s to the 1970s, it seems to me that Hilferding's general theory should be regarded as substantially correct. I already read that. Even in the economic crisis of the 1930s, most capitalist states did not experience that degree of instability which would have allowed a significant revolutionary movement to develop. And the principal result of the crisis was to promote a further growth of state intervention, which, as in the case of Roosevelt's New Deal, helped to, quote, save capitalism, end quote, to create the conditions in which it was able to resume its rapid growth after 1945, and to make possible the development of, quote, welfare states and, quote, mixed economies. Insofar as Hilferding did make serious political misjudgments, and this would have to be demonstrated by a more thorough and detailed study of his career, these should be attributed, in my view, to the complexity and, from another aspect, the hopelessness of the German situation in a highly unfavorable international context, rather than to fundamental weaknesses in his theoretical analysis. The crucial features of German society were its profound authoritarianism and nationalism, which the revolutionary movement of 1918, as Hilferding recognized, had failed to eradicate, or even seriously diminish, because the right-wing SPD leaders did not attempt to destroy the power of the old landowning and military groups, and the total absence of an established and vigorous democratic tradition. Footnote, the limits of German liberal and democratic thought are well illustrated in the political writings of Max Weber, which are more than anything else intensely nationalistic. See for an excellent brief account of Weber's views, Wolfgang Mommsen's book Wolfgang Mommsen's book, The Age of Bureaucracy. End footnote. It was these social and cultural conditions which provided such a favorable environment for the growth of the fascist movement, and on the other hand made it a matter of vital importance for the Social Democrats to uphold, so far as they could, the frail and weakly democracy of the Weimar Republic. New section, Section 5. By the mid-1930s, as the National Socialists consolidated their rule in Germany and fascism was victorious in Austria, Hilferding, like other Austro-Marxists and other SPD leaders, recognized the need for a more revolutionary kind of politics and the use of force in order to oppose fascism effectively. Footnote: see his article Revolutionärer Sozialismus of 1934 and later articles under the pseudonym Richard Kern in Neuer Vorwärts, and the comments by Louis J. Edinger in the book German Exile Politics. By the late 1930s, as Edinger and others have noted, Hilferding's outlook had become increasingly pessimistic in face of the concentrated power, military and other, of the totalitarian states, and this is reflected in his writings of that period. It may also account for the fact that he seems not to have made very strenuous efforts to escape into a more remote exile after the fall of France. And footnote. These preoccupations are clearly to be seen in his last unfinished work, Das historische Problem, a theoretical summation of 3 decades of political thought and experience which encompassed 2 world wars, the economic crisis of the 1930s, the triumph of fascism in Germany and Austria, and the establishment of the Stalinist dictatorship in the USSR. Hilferding now undertook a systematic revision of his conception of the state, which he, along with other Austro-Marxists, had long regarded as an increasingly independent element in the industrial and democratic societies of the West. Hilferding now recognized that this independent power, rather than being used within a democratic system, might be transformed into an instrument of total oppression. Hilferding's new analysis of the state is presented briefly in an article titled State Capitalism or Totalitarian State Economy, which discusses the nature of Soviet society and is developed more fully in Das historische Problem. In the later text, he argues that the, quote, political superstructure of society is a power in its own right, with its own agencies, its own tendencies, and its own interests. The development of state power accompanies the development of modern economy. End quote. Hilferding continues, quote, the political problems of the post-war period consist in the change in the relation of the state to society, brought about by the subordination of the economy to the coercive power of the state. The state becomes a totalitarian state to the extent that this process of subordination takes place, ... end quote. Hilferding. There's a footnote that I missed. In the concluding paragraphs, Hilferding observes that Marxists had expected the state to wither away in a socialist society. Quote, but history, that, quote, best of all Marxists, end quote, has taught us another lesson. It has taught us that in spite of Engels' expectations, the, quote, administration of things, end quote, may become an unlimited, quote, domination over men, end quote, and thus lead not only to emancipation of the state from the economy, but even to the subjection of the economy by the holders of state power, end quote. Hilferding. Later, Hilferding observes that, quote, the subordination of all historically significant social processes to the consciousness of the state, to the conscious will of the state, means the suppression of those areas of social life which previously were free from state influence and were regulated by autonomous laws, end quote. Footnote, this is very similar to the analysis made later by a Polish sociologist who had experienced the totalitarian state in 2 forms, first under the Nazi occupation, afterwards under the Stalinist regime, and wrote in a study of class structure, quote, in situations where changes of social structure are to a greater or lesser degree governed by the decisions of the political authorities, we are a long way from classes conceived of as groups arising out of the spontaneous activities of individuals, or at the most as spontaneously created class organizations, where the political authorities can overtly and effectively change the class structure, where the privileges that are most essential for social status, including that of a higher share in the national income, are conferred by a decision of the political authorities, where a large part or even the majority of the population is included in a stratification of the type to be found in a bureaucratic hierarchy. The 19th century concept of class becomes more or less an anachronism, and class conflicts give way to other forms of social antagonism, and Stanislav Osovsky, in the book Class Structure in the Social Consciousness. End footnote. Hilferding then turns to a critical exposition of the, quote, Marxian interpretation of history, and, quote, devoting particular attention to Marx's conception of the state, which did not, quote, attribute to it any independent power, end quote, and to, quote, the most difficult problem, end quote, of, quote, the relation between class interest and class consciousness. Between class interest and class consciousness, end quote. Here he discusses the long and complex historical process in which particular interests undergo a transformation in consciousness and are, quote, sublimated into general interests, with the result that the economic and social demands of the group are transformed into a claim to rule society as a whole, end quote. The manuscript ends at the point where Hilferding embarks upon an analysis of the problem of working class consciousness, and notes in the first place that, quote, nowhere has socialist consciousness taken hold of the entire working class, end quote. Hilferding. This was clearly the prelude to a discussion of the reason for the failure of the working class movement to oppose effectively the rise of fascism and the establishment in diverse forms of an unlimited despotic state power. Finance Capital is one of the classic works of Marxist theory, and as I have tried to show in this introduction, it possesses far more than a purely historical interest for the present generation. The ideas which Hilferding formulated here, and in some cases developed further in his later writings, about the role of cartels and trusts, both nationally and internationally, the influence of the banks, quote, organized capitalism, end quote, as a stage in the movement toward a socialized economy, the growth of the, quote, interventionist state, end quote, with its inherent potentiality for becoming a system of total power, and the politics of imperialism, are all highly relevant in the analysis of recent and current economic and political trends, and they are more widely debated than at any time since the 1920s. Above all, Hilferding's book stands as a model for any renewed attempt to, quote, attain a scientific understanding, of the latest phase of capitalist development, end quote, in the vastly changed circumstances of today, after a further 70 years of tempestuous growth. Okay. And that is the end of the introduction by Tom Bottomore to Rudolf Hilferding's Finance Capital, a study of the latest phase of capitalist development. Thank you so much for listening.